Today we're going to be adding integers day number 1. Our content objective is students will be able to find the additive inverse of integers, find the sum of integers by comparing them, and language objective is students will be able to describe verbally how to add integers by comparing. Why am I learning this? Well, it's important for many real-world problems like tracking your daily calorie count. So, quick, let's go over some vocabulary. Remember what an additive inverse are. Basically two numbers with a sum of 0. So basically they're opposite numbers. Okay, opposite numbers are additive inverses. Some would include -3 and 3, 17 and -17, -324 and 324. All of these are examples of additive inverses. So remember, they're basically two numbers with a sum of 0. In fact, I'm pretty sure you can come up with your own, right? So for me, I would come up with maybe 9 and -9. Those are additive inverses. So let's take a look at this example here. Notice we have 3 apples and we have 6 oranges. Well, let's think. Do we have more apples or do we have more oranges? Hopefully your answer is we have more oranges. In fact, we have 6 of them. And then here, we're going to say, okay, well, how many apples do we have? Well, we have 3 apples. So the next question is, well, do we have more apples or do we have more oranges? Hopefully your answer is oranges. But the question is, well, how many more oranges are there than apples? Well, if there's 6 oranges and 3 apples, I would definitely say there are 3 more oranges than there are apples. So I would say there's 3 more oranges. Okay, so now let's go ahead and try some numbers. So again, we're going to be adding integers, and we're going to do that by comparing the amount of positives and the amount of negatives. The very first question that I like to ask is, do we have more positives or do we have more negatives? Here I know there's not a sign, but we know that this is a positive 3, so we have 3 positives and we have 6 negatives. So to answer the question, are there more positives or are there more negatives, I would definitely say there are more negatives. Okay, there are more negatives. So the very first thing I'm going to do is, because I recognize there's more negatives, I'm going to go ahead and say my answer is going to be negative. So I'm going to go ahead and write down there are 6 negatives. So I'm going to put 6 and I'm going to circle negative. Now, are there any positives? The answer is yes. There's 3 positives. So I'm going to go ahead and put 3 and that they are positives. So now the question is, how many more negatives are there than positives? There are 6 negatives and 3 positives. So how many more negatives are there than positives? Well, if there's 6 negatives and 3 positives, I would say there's 3 more negatives. So I'm going to go ahead and say my answer is a -3. Okay, so let's go ahead and try another one. Here, ask yourself, are there more positives or are there more negatives? Looking at this is a positive 11 and this is a -3. Definitely going to say there's more positives, so I'm going to start with a positive there. There's definitely more positives. Now that I have that, I'm just going to go ahead and separate things from positives and negatives. Well, how many positives are there? There's 11 positives, so I'm going to go ahead and circle positives there. And how many negatives are there? There are 3 negatives. Well, how many more positives are there than negatives? Well, if there's 11 positives and 3 negatives, I would say there are 8 more positives than there are negatives. So my answer is -8. Okay, so now this one's a little bit different. So let's try this one. Ask ourselves, are there more positives or are there more negatives? Well, here we have a -14 and here we have a -8. Guess what? Since they're both negatives, my only option is there are definitely more negatives. So I'm going to go ahead and write a negative there. Now, I'm going to first address negatives. How many negatives are there? You got to be careful. Notice there's 14 negatives here and 8 negatives here. So altogether, there's actually a total of 22 negatives. So I'm going to write -22. Now the next question is, we took care of negatives. Now the next thing to do is look at positives. How many positives do we have? I hope you notice there are no positives at all. So I'm going to go ahead and write 0 positives. So now that I've separated negatives and positives, I'm going to ask how many more negatives are there than positives? Well, the answer is 22. There's no positives at all, so I'm going to say there's 22 negatives than there are positives. So my answer is a -22. So this one, notice, there are going to be cases where you might have 0 of one sign. So here I will notice there are 0 positives. There's no positives at all in this particular expression. So moving on. Okay, let's try number 4. Here, we're going to ask ourselves the same question. Are there more positives or are there more negatives? Hopefully your answer is there are more negatives. So let's go ahead and start with the negatives first. How many negatives do we have exactly? Well, there are 27 negatives. Well, this is positive, so I'm not going to count that. So I'm going to go ahead and write 27. Now that we've taken care of negatives, let's take care of positives. How many positives do I have? Well, this is a positive 9, so I'm going to go ahead and say there are 9 positives. So the next question is, well, how many more negatives are there than positives? Hopefully at this stage, when you're comparing them, you start realizing in order to figure out how many more you have of one than the other, you simply take the difference. So what you could do is simply subtract. And that's why we always put the amount that has more of the sign that we have more of, we always put on top so we can easily subtract them. So if I subtract this, so 17 minus 9 is 8. 1 minus nothing is 1. So I would claim there are 18 more negatives than there are positives. And that's why my answer is negative 18. Okay. So now, let's try one more. Here, the question is, are there more negatives or are there more positives? This one's tricky. Why, you might ask? Because there's 19 negatives and 19 positives. They're exactly the same. So I can't really decide because there isn't actually more of one than another. So here, you're just going to go ahead and say, well, there's 19. Sorry, let's try it. There are 19 negatives and 19 positives. There isn't more of one, so I'm just going to go ahead and not put a sign. But how many more of negatives are there than positives? Well, they're exactly the same. So I would say 0. There isn't more of one than another. And again, in order to find how much more than there is of another, you can simply find the difference, and you would find, hey, 19 minus 19 is 0. In fact, what I want you to realize is these are additive inverses. And what do we know about additive inverses? Is we know the sum of the two numbers are 0. Okay, so at this point, I'd like you to pause the video and try number 6 by yourself. So let's see how well we did. First, we should be asking, are there more positives or are there more negatives? Hopefully your answer is there are definitely more negatives. So because there's more negatives, I'm going to go ahead and write down that our answer is going to be negative because there's more of them. So how many negatives are there? Hopefully you recognize there's 24 negatives here and there's 9 negatives here. So altogether, we should have a total of 33 negatives. What about positives? How many positives are there? I don't see any. So I would say there are 0 positives. So the next question is to ask, well, how many more negatives are there than positives? My answer would be 33. Why? Because there's no positives at all. And so hopefully your answer was negative 33. Okay, moving on. Number 7. So here, same idea. You're going to use the same concept, but you're not going to have a template to follow. But first thing you should always ask yourself is there more positives or are there more negatives? Hopefully your answer is positive. Okay? Then the next question is, okay, well, how many positives are there? Well, we have here, I can see there's 25 positives. And what about negatives? Well, there are 18 negatives. Now the question is, well, how many more positives are there than negatives? Well, in order to find how much more there is of another, you need to find the difference. So if we find the difference between the two, you're going to find that there is 7 more positives than there were negatives. So my answer is positive 7. So to use my sentence frame, I would say the sum of 25 and negative 18 is positive 7. Okay, how about number 18? Let's try it again. First, you should be asking yourself, are there more positives or are there more negatives? Hopefully your answer is there are more positives. So I'm going to go ahead and put my positive sign. Now please note that when you type this answer into your homework assignment, you're not actually going to put a positive sign. We typically don't write it. But I'm putting it there to kind of tell my brain that I did figure out what's there more of, positives or negatives. So since there's more positives, I'm going to first start with positives. How many positives are there? Well, here I can see there are 34 positives. And then what about negatives? Well, according to this, there are 23 negatives. So now the question is, well, how many more positives are there than negatives? Well, to do that, you need to find the difference between the two. How many more positives are there? Well, let's subtract. 4 minus 3 is 1. 3 minus 2 is 1. So I'm left with a positive 11. So to use a sentence frame, I would say the sum of negative 23 and 34 is 11. Okay, next one. Here, let's go a little bit quicker. Here, ask yourself once more, are there more positives or are there more negatives? Hopefully you see here that there's more negatives, so let's start with negatives first. How many negatives are there? Well, there's 27 of them. Okay, well, what about positives? I see that there are 13 positives. So now, once again, you're going to compare. How many more negatives are there in comparison to positives? Well, in order to do that, we need to find the difference. So let's go ahead and subtract them. 7 minus 3 is 4. 2 minus 1 is 1. So I'm left with a negative 14. So here to answer the question, I would say the sum of a negative 27 and 13 is negative 14. Okay, so now let's take a look at what we did yesterday. Yesterday we did symbols, we did a number line, and today we did comparison. I'm going to go ahead and do number 10 using all three methods that I've learned so far. So the first one's with symbols. Negative 8, I'm going to go ahead and write 8 negatives. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Now plus 15, that means there's 15 positives, so I'm going to add 15 positives. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15. At this stage, hopefully you can see that there are some zero pairs. In fact, there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, leaving me with only 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 positives, which I would write as a positive 7. Okay, well, what about a number line? Okay, starting with a number line, I should start at the origin, which is 0. I'm going to first move to negative 8. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So you should be drawing a line to negative 8, which is right here. So now we're going to add. Add means we're going to move forward. And here it says we're going to move forward 15. So I'm going to move forward 15 from this point, which is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Let me add some more. 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15. So here it would go all the way to this point. So what is my answer? Let's count. It's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So notice, even with the number line, my answer is a 7. In fact, we can look at zero pairs. You're going to look for the overlap. And in the overlap, you're going to find there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Now, is that right? Well, here we had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So notice it's the same either way. But now, let's talk about a comparison. That's the method we use today. With comparison, you're going to ask yourself, are there more negatives or are there more positives? Taking a look at this, I'm going to definitely say there are more positives. So my answer is going to be positive. Now, since we talked about there's being more positives, let's count how many positives there are. Looking at this, I can see there are 15 positives. Well, what about negatives? How many negatives do we have? According to this problem, I see that there's 8 negatives. So now we need to compare. How many more positives are there than negatives? Well, in order to compare, we need to find the difference. So 15 minus 8 is 7. So notice my answer is a positive 7. Now let's think. These are all great ways of getting to the answer. Some are very visual, which are nice, like symbols and number line. But if you'll notice, a comparison method is going to be a lot quicker. Because can you imagine if the numbers were larger? Can you imagine writing down 99 positive signs or 75 negative signs? That can be very overwhelming, right? So you're going to find using the comparison method can definitely speed up the process. Okay, so now Like I said, the comparison method is actually very beneficial in the sense where it saves you some time, especially when numbers are larger, like in this example here. So at this stage, I would like you to go ahead and pause the video and try numbers 11 through 15 by yourself. Okay, so let's go over the answers. For number 11, were there more negatives or were there more positives? I would say negatives. Now here, let's think. Because there's more negatives, let's first take care of negatives. How many negatives were there? Well, there was 73 here and there was 19 here. So how many negatives altogether? Well, in order to figure out how many negatives there were altogether, I'm going to have to add them. So 73 plus 19 is going to give me 92 negatives. But what about positives? How many positives were there? Well, there's none. So I would say there's 0 positives. So here, how many more negatives were there than positives? I would say 92. And that's it. Okay, now let's look at number 12. Are there more negatives or are there more positives? I would say there's neither. They're an equal amount. So let's just go ahead and say there's 67 positives and there's 67 negatives. Because we want to figure out how many more positives there are negatives, we're going to find the difference. If we find the difference, we're going to find that the difference is 0. So my answer is 0. Now, let me ask you this. Do you remember what these numbers are called? Hopefully you remember they are called additive inverses. Why? Because there's two numbers in which the sum of the two numbers is 0. Okay, what about number 13? Are there more positives or are there more negatives? Hopefully your answer is negative. Let's count how many negatives there are. Well, there's 53 negatives here and 49 negatives here. So altogether, I would say there is 102 negatives. Okay, well, what about positives? How many positives are there? Well, there's no positives here and no positives here, so I'm just going to put 0. So again, you're going to ask yourself, how many more negatives are there than positives? Well, in order to do that, you find the difference and say, okay, I would say there are 102 more negatives. Keep going. Number 14, are there more negatives or are there more positives? I would say there are definitely more negatives because there's 40 negatives and only 11 positives. So here, let's write down 40 negatives. Well, how many positives are there? According to this, there are 11 positives. But we need to compare. How many more negatives are there than positives? Well, let's find the difference between the two. We're going to borrow. I'm going to find 10 minus 1 is 9, 3 minus 1 is 2. There are 29 more negatives than there are positives. Now, last but not least, are there more negatives or are there more positives? I would definitely say negative. Now here, let's start with negatives. We're going to say there's 131 negatives. Are there any positives? Yes, there are 5 positives. So how many more negatives are there than positives? Well, again, to find to compare them, you're just going to have to find the difference between the two to see how many more negatives there are than positives. So let's go ahead and borrow. 11 minus 5 is 6. 2 minus nothing is 2, and 1 minus nothing is 1. So I would say there's 126 more negatives than there were positives. So once again, the comparison method is really nice in the sense that you do not have to write out 131 negatives or maybe even write it on a number line. It saves you a lot of time. So the comparison method is definitely more efficient. The number line as well as the symbols is very helpful because it's very visual, but again, it's going to be a good thing for you to be comfortable using the comparison method as well, because realistically that's what you're going to do in 7th and 8th grade. Well, guess what? That concludes the lesson for today. Thank you so much for tuning in, and as always, until next time, bye!